My name's Karen Brown. I'm a longtime science reporter for public radio, mostly at New England Public Radio, which is an NPR affiliate in Western Massachusetts. I've also been a DART Ochberg Fellow, which is a wonderful program covering trauma, as I'm sure you all know. I make audio documentaries and podcasts on trauma and mental health issues, and I love coming to these gatherings because it's just like Disneyland for science reporters, especially those interested in mental health care. So in the past decade, an especially compelling topic in mental health is the brain science of adversity. What happens to our brains with early experience, good and bad? On the good side, of course, parents take great pains to help their children's brains get off to a good start through music or nature or play, and that's just something that we intuitively understand. We also intuitively understand the need to help the brain get wired right even before memories are formed. And then on the flip side, of course, when early experiences are bad, even non-scientists can understand that trauma can stick with you for many years, if not a lifetime. But what is going on exactly in the brain to make that happen? That's a question that I've always found fascinating. Why do some people seem to get through horrendous young experiences relatively unscathed? And why do others spend a lifetime dealing with the psychological and sometimes physical consequences of that? So our speaker, Stacy Drury, is one of the premier experts trying to answer these questions. She's a professor of psychiatry at Tulane University in New Orleans. She directs the Stress Environment Research Collaborative in Health Disparities. She's involved in a fascinating longitudinal study, which hopefully she'll talk about later, called the Bucharest Early Intervention Study, which her team has been following children in Romania who were left in orphanages, see how they develop in a range of circumstances. And it's the only randomized controlled trial of foster care versus institutions in the world. It's a fascinating study. One of her primary focuses is on how genes interact with experience and how combined they lead to different outcomes in brain and behavior. And today she's also going to give us a primer on how the brain reacts to early experiences, and she'll help dispel some common myths. So, Stacy, thank you.
Done? Is that okay? Can you guys hear me? Good, because I wander. Okay, I'm going to go quick through this part because there's a lot. Please interrupt and slow me down because this is really for you to learn, not for me to just ramble aimlessly. So I'm going to make it as interactive as possible, and now they've let me be mobile, so it will be interactive. And for any of you who had too much to eat for breakfast, I'm going to focus on you and make sure you stay awake. Okay. Hey, did that go on its own? All right, disclosures. I spend a lot of time talking to a wide range of people about the impact of adversity broadly defined. And it turns out that I'm also a very simplistic thinker. And so I have, where's the hand signal? Okay. And so I've come up with some really important, very, if you remember nothing else, these are the key points to take home. So don't breathe underwater is one. The second is that kids are different than adults, right? So this is where I struggle with judges a lot. Kids are not all the same, and I think Karen's point about this, and we had some conversations last night about resilience, which is incredibly understudied. Parents are important, and I put parents up here, but I really want you to think about this in a much broader context and think about it as caregivers. We are really bad at studying caregivers. We're really good at studying moms, but we're not really good at studying dads. I had a lot of grandmothers tell me they're wickedly important in the South, and they are. And so parents is where a lot of the data is, but to really think about caregivers or primary people that help create an environment where kids are able to be safe and learn. And then for the most part, this one, trauma, bad, right? Okay, so this is all you need to remember. Everything else is kind of lagniappe. This is the outline. For those of you who like Mythbusters, we're going to do a lot of that. And we'll talk about things that are not quite accurate. So brain development. So first of all, brain development begins at conception. And it keeps going and going and going. And this is the first of 2 times I'll mention the Energizer Bunny. But brain development is not static, which means that we have both opportunities for bad things to impact brain development, as well as opportunities for good things to enhance brain development, all right? And we're gonna talk about that ratio and how it changes across development later. The parts of the brain develop at different rates. So does anyone know in the United States at what age you can rent a car? What age you can rent a car? 25. Does anyone know why? Okay, so it turns out it's not because of the cerebral cortex. It is actually because the insurance company looked at rates in accidents, particularly in adolescent males, and said that the cost benefit of allowing people to rent a car finally evens out at 25. Now, it's actually because of prefrontal cortex development. But the insurance companies didn't know that. They were just saying, hey, who's the dumbest drivers? And when can we decrease the risk of having a really stupid driver? And that happens to be at 25, right? And so that's when the front part of our brain, our executive function, our decision making, the ability to keep those impulses to have that 4th cookie or 6th glass of wine or that cute other person over there and go see them, to keep that impulse under control isn't done until we're 25. So I think that is important, right, for a couple reasons. One, that means that experiences until the age of 25 shape that, right? But it also means that if we've had really difficult things happen, we have a window of opportunity that I absolutely exist until about 25, right? So while I am a huge little kid component, and I think everything important happens pretty much before the age of 3, I now have an adolescent child, so I'm hoping that there's some remodeling that happens then too, right? Okay. And that experiences have to be, for some of our stuff to develop, we have to have exposures to develop things, and many of our processes and how our brain works are actually also dependent upon that, right? So positive and negative experiences influence how our brain develops. And the areas of the brain that are developing most rapidly when an exposure occurs, right? And this can be malnutrition. This can be a really amazing interaction with a caregiver. This can be, war and forced migration. But when we think about the impact on that child, we must recognize that those impacts differ because the brain is different across development, right? So when we have the exposure is as important as what the exposure is. Okay. So audience participation game number 1. For those of you who are in Jordan, not allowed to answer, keep your hands down. Everybody has to answer, okay? So these are pictures of human brains. And what I'd like you to do is tell me which brain is the brain of a newborn, okay? So audience participation, so we're gonna start with, is it this one? You gotta raise your hands. This one? Okay, is it this one? This one? This one? Many of you have not raised your hands yet, just saying. This one? This one? And this one. Okay, this is great, there's like no consensus. It's actually this one. Which one? Yeah, pretty amazing, right? Before birth, and then this is the adult brain. These are all prenatal. They're what? All prenatal. This is a newborn. Yeah, wow, right? So I will also say that at what age do you think we have the most neurons, the most absolute number of brain cells ever? So it's not newborn. So is it 10? It's 2. So that toddler that is pitching a temper tantrum, if they could tell you that they were smarter than you, they are. Right? There's massive pruning or loss of brain cells that happen in the adolescent years. So you are actually dumber than your children because you've lost all of those brain connections by the time you're 25. But that's a huge amount of shaping of the brain that happens, right? And that shaping actually is really, really important and dependent upon experiences, and these are the terms that we use to describe the shaping of the brain. So the first is neurogenesis. This is the birth of neurons, right? So that is hugely done before birth and then up to age 2. And then when I was in medical school, we didn't think anything else happened. And now every day we discover that there's different parts of the brain that have small amounts of neurogenesis or rebirth of these neurons. But for the most part, it's pretty much done by 2. Synaptogenesis is the connections that are forming between the brain cells, all right? And that's really, really important because if I don't form a connection, I don't make a circuit. And if I don't make a circuit, I can't do a behavior. I can't process an emotion. I can't remember, right? Pruning is a really important thing that allows us to maximize our brain's efficiency. So pruning, do any of you play an instrument? A musical instrument? Okay, no, okay, you gotta raise, you guys have gotta be more active here. It's gonna be a really long 40 minutes. Does anyone here play a musical instrument? Thank you, okay. So there are parts of your brain that you have pruned away, that you have made super, super, super linear, and you have myelinated them. Because if you were playing an instrument, you're not paying attention to how you do it, right? Like the ability to like play on a keyboard, you kind of can zone out and do that. That's the function of pruning away brain cells that had your fingers going in different directions and myelinating the underlying circuits so that you are faster, more efficient, and better. Right? Yeah.
So, from what I gather, the first 2 are things that your brain does, and the third one is. Sorry, the first 2 in the list are things that your brain does, and the pruning part is something that your environment kind of does to your brain, depending on what activities and experiences you have.
That's a great way to say it. You want to do the rest of the talk?
No, because I have no idea. I don't even know how to pronounce the
Okay. But so what she said is really important. So yes, so this is really what your brain comes into the world with, and these 2 processes are the processes. I mean, can I quote you on that later? Okay, good. But those 2 processes are the way that experience refines the function of the brain. And now I'm going to use that forever. Thank you. Okay. So this is a brain cell, right? And so this are the connectors. These are the synapses, right? This is what we like to think of the insulation. This is the myelin, right? And so what does myelin do? It makes the connections, the circuits, much stronger, and it makes them faster. And this is the last part of the brain to fully myelinate. That's why teenagers are really bad at making decisions, right? Because those circuits are kind of a little wobbly and they haven't been myelinated. And so they can't like, ooh, it's really fun to go 100 miles an hour. Oh wait, I'm not supposed to do that, right? That is a circuit that tells me that despite the fact that it's really fun to go 100 miles an hour, I shouldn't, right? So we have to myelinate that circuit to make it efficient and effective, right? These are synapses, so you'll sometimes hear about neurotransmitters and how cortisol does this or that. These are chemicals in our brain that send signals across to other neurons. This is part of how our synapses function. So when people talk about low serotonin and depression, serotonin is a chemical that is released by one neuron, and it goes and activates another neuron. Now, it also actually functions predominantly in the GI system. So have any of you ever been nervous and had your stomach kind of feel like there were butterflies in it? Yeah, see, good audience participation, right? So it turns out that the greatest production of serotonin is actually in the gut. Interesting, right? Because we can't separate brain and body function. And we're going to talk about how that relates to treatment later. This is actually going to be an image of the longitudinal development of myelin in the brain. And it's got really pretty colors, but for what you want to know is blue is actually myelinated regions of the brain. And what you'll see is that the back part of the brain, so our part that's really a big emotion regulator, myelinates first. And then it takes a really, really long time, and there's this forward progression of this myelination to make it more efficient. Okay, so you're never going to get to see this, sorry. But it's really pretty. It's a YouTube video, and I'll send it to you. But basically what this shows is that the process of myelination, this final solidifying of these circuits, is a slow process, and it ends in the front, all right? So the latest developing final parts of brain development really impact our decision-making, our cognitive flexibility, our executive function, our working memory, all of those processes that are incredibly important to function, and P.S. way more important than IQ. Okay, so this is the same conceptualization of everything we've talked about in a graph, with the idea that all of these processes kind of overlay upon each other. All right, how many of you played Jenga? God, I love this. Okay, you should play Jenga. But so one of the things about Jenga is that the tighter you put those blocks together, right, the better they are aligned with each other. The more you can pull out, right, the more complex the pattern. Similarly, with brain development, the tighter that we grow those blocks in the earlier phases, the more complex our brains are able to function, right? So if you have ever let a 4-year-old start the Jenga tower, right, it's pretty wobbly, and like 3 or 4 blocks into it, it all falls apart, right? And if you let me do it, because I'm a little bit OCD, they're like super locked in, and you can take out like all of them, and it's still standing. That's what I want you to take home from this idea about brain development, is the more we input into the early brain, the more we are able to remodel, to create complex thought processes, to regulate emotion, to have better memory processes. But if we start with a very wobbly base, the ability to recover is harder. It is not necessarily absent, but it is definitely harder. So, key points, don't memorize them. Brain development is not a static process. Experience is incredibly important, and we have a lot of room for these processes. Okay, so remember I said this ratio of input to fix things versus cost, right? So one of the things is if we think about sort of plasticity, and for you guys, plasticity is just the ability to sort of change or rewire. The earlier we get in, the less input is required to rewire, right? So we have more plasticity early on, right? And so it doesn't take a lot of effort to change what's happening. But as we get older, right? So how many of you decided you wanted to learn to play tennis at age 30? Yeah, really hard, right? And you see those little 5-year-olds out there and they've got a backhand and you're like, what the hell? It's not okay, right? That's this, exactly, right? But imagine this in terms of cognitive abilities, executive function, regulating your emotions. It's really hard to teach my boss, not Charlie, a different boss, to regulate his emotions, because I don't think he did a lot of that down here. So, but I'm not telling you which boss, so we'll keep that a secret. But there's this idea that there is abilities to shift things, but it takes a lot more effort, a lot more practice to be able to do that the older we get, the more the systems are put in place. Okay, mythbuster number 1. We do not believe that there is ever an age at which the exposure to adversity or trauma does not leave a mark. Now, do I think that a child exposed to Hurricane Katrina at 1 can tell me exactly how many dead bodies they saw floating by them? No. Do I think it has an impact? Absolutely. All right? I spend a lot of time with surgeons who are like, oh, don't worry about those 15 blood draws that we did in that baby or the little liver transplant kid. They're not going to remember it. They do. Whether it is our sort of narrative memory where I can tell a story, no. But there are biologic imprints of these experiences, and there is not an age that is too young. And so that means that just because a mom doesn't think that her 1-year-old had this exposure and it mattered, doesn't mean that we don't have to help her understand that perhaps some of the behaviors this kid is demonstrating might be a weird way that that kid is expressing a fear of something she doesn't know that they actually saw. Okay, so one of the hopefully less complex papers that I had you guys, okay. Oh, you're gonna ask a question? Okay. Papers is actually by Margaret Sheridan and Kate McLaughlin, who are really great, very good thinkers. And one of the things that's really important when we think about these refugees is the dimensional aspects of exposure, right? So it turns out in animal models and preclinical models, I can isolate these, but we don't get to isolate these in actual children, right? The idea that you could have deprivation, meaning I could have deprivation of people talking to me, not have toys, not have nutrition. But I can also have variances in the amount of threat, right? So we could have kids that moved with nothing but didn't come from a very high threat environment. But we have, unfortunately, a huge amount of children who are coming from incredibly terrifying environments. And because of some political reasons, which I will not say too much about, into incredibly traumatic environments, and unfortunately also have high deprivation. And to be clear, we do not have data that is specific to this. All right, we have maltreatment data where we can talk about high threat, and in general that kind of correlates a little bit with SES challenges, can accentuate those. We're going to talk a lot about this low deprivation environment that was in the environment that the Bucharest Early Intervention Project worked in. But we have an absence of clear data on what is happening in the brains of kids that have high threat, high deprivation for persistent long periods of time. And more importantly, many of the things that we do to treat trauma exposure require that the child is safe, right? And we all know that many of the kids that we are working with or seeing or writing stories about or interacting with, they're still terrified. And our evidence-based treatments for the most part require that those children are safe. And that's one of the gaps that we really need to think about. And so I'm really excited to hear Teresa's talk. The other thing is that trauma and adversity are not functioning in isolation. That's not the only thing happening to kids. So I talk a lot about the exposome. And the exposome is both the environmental pieces, and it's both positive and negative, right? So we've got toxins in the environment, but we also have positive things in the environment, right? And so for us to think about how we can shift this balance in these environments, how can we maximize healthy nutrition for kids that were malnourished? And if we can't keep them safe, what can we do to create kind of buffers or bubble wrap, right? And so this is this idea that we need to step back and take a look at the whole picture, even when we're talking about brain development, because all of these things influence the synapses, influence the pruning, influence the myelination, okay? This you can't read, but it's actually really important because it turns out that if I don't have a healthy body, my ability to sculpt a healthy brain is minimal, all right? And so when we think about trying to decrease the impact of trauma, we have to make sure that these kids are healthy. We have to make sure they can sleep. We have to make sure they have nutrition. Oh yeah, and we have to make sure that their caregivers can do all of those things, because again, none of my interventions, none of our evidence-based practices work if the child is starving, or if the child has tuberculosis, or if the child has diarrhea and dehydrated. So these pieces are not separate from each other, and we really have to keep that conceptualization in there. Okay, so does anyone know what stress is? You do? Good. Okay, you're up next. Come on up. Stress is a lot of things, right? Has anyone here, this is going to be a really good question to ask this group. How many, I'm just going to say this, how many of you have jumped out of an airplane on purpose? Okay. Why? You've heard me do this before. Why, right? Totally dumb idea. There's a guy who's flying the plane. He's going to land it, right? And somebody decides to jump out of an airplane. So did you choose to do that more than once? Yeah, probably. Okay.
One time.
One time, just once, yeah. That's what you
One
told
time.
That's what you told your mother. Okay, right? So that is probably one of the most terrifying, stupid things I have ever heard. And he did it on purpose. I don't get it. Okay, so why do I say that? Because stress is about the actual exposure, but it is very much about the perception. And those two things together influence the physiologic processes that we call stress, okay? And each and every one of those exposures has a developmental approach to it. So when I was 8, I really wanted to jump out of airplanes. And then when I was 17, I really tried to jump out of an airplane. And then when I got my frontal cortex at 25, I thought it was a stupid idea. Not saying anything about your frontal cortex, Ariel. But the point is that what we think is stressful, what we think is scary, changes across the course of development. And that's really, really important because what we think influences this almost as much as what the exposure is. Okay. So there are many different physiologic stress response systems, and they all interact, and they all have their own regulatory capacities. So we'll talk about one of my favorite myths, right? Your autonomic nervous system, what controls your heart rate? What is making my mouth a little dry right now? What about early on, the middle of the first minute of the talk, my hand does this, it makes my hand shake, and then I'm like, oh, I'm done, right? The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, this is cortisol, is only one of our many different stress response systems. The hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, so what controls the regulation of your hormones, your testosterone, your estrogen, so boys, you have estrogen too. That is actually a stress response system. So the best example of that is girls who have anorexia. It's an incredibly physiological, stressful experience. Their HPG axis shuts down. If I were to, probably not you, you look really laid back. If I were to make Ariel come up and give a talk right now, not only would we increase his cortisol and his heart rate, his testosterone goes up. And actually my testosterone would go up too, and then I would be better at giving a talk than him, but because it's a competitive kind of thing. There are also cellular stress response systems, and we'll talk about the one that I study. And then the immune system. So how many of you have ever gotten sick when you're preparing for a big exam or a big presentation? Yeah, that's that stress response system, right? So when we think about stress, please don't think just in terms of one physiological pathway, because cortisol is not the stress hormone, okay? It's really not. It's one of my biggest pet peeves. I know, people are confused. They're like, that's all we hear about. Cortisol is actually a good thing. Cortisol patterns change across the course of a day. I'm not sure if that's the next slide. Oh yeah, here. This is the other part of this. All stress is bad. And when you live in a stressful environment, you produce too much cortisol and it kills your brain cells. That's not true, it's inaccurate, and it's a very, very clear oversimplification. Now, if I were to take neuronal cells and put them in a petri dish and bathe them in super high doses of cortisol, yes, they would die. But that is not physiologically relevant, and that's not what happens. Instead, cortisol is a fight or flight hormone, but it opens you to awareness. It is incredibly important in learning and attention, and it is this opening up of your brain to information and to processing that information, and it helps solidify memories. And if we don't elevate our cortisol or we don't change our cortisol patterns, we don't learn. If our cortisol does not have a little bump in the morning, we don't get out of bed, right? So about 30 minutes after you wake up, your cortisol goes up. That's so you actually get out of bed. And it sometimes happens while you're drinking your coffee. But if that doesn't happen, it's difficult to wake up. And if our cortisol doesn't drop down over the course of the day, it's really hard to go to sleep, right? So disruptions in the regulation of cortisol are what are really, really important, not how much cortisol you have. And I will have that a lot, right? And trauma can influence both the reactivity that we need to learn and the diurnal pattern that we need to regulate our metabolism, our sleep-wake cycles, our circadian cycles. And potentially we lose that flexibility in that system, and that's where the problem arises, okay? But please, if you've learned nothing else, cortisol is not all bad. It's actually really, really important. If you didn't have it, you'd be dead. So keep that in mind. Okay, so a little stress is a good thing, right? It allows learning, higher performances, drives development, and P.S. we can't get rid of it anyway. All right, so what are the neural pathways that we're going to talk about that are impacted by stress, right, or adversity? So backstory on this, working with the amazing authors, most terrifying thing I've ever done because I didn't know how it was going to turn out. So that was from a series done, so Pew gave a grant to these two amazing reporters. We spent a year sort of talking them through this. And why I will always come to this and help Bruce with this is that an alumni of Tulane saw this video and gave us a $3 million grant to teach MPH and med students and social work students how to do community engaged work so that we can address this issue in New Orleans. And I will tell you that working with those two journalists was an amazing experience for me because the conversation back and forth was what shaped this. and what now has an impact. And if we don't have those conversations back and forth, I don't know what that would have looked like. But that's one of the reasons that I come here, is that I really realize that it absolutely has, because something like this was way more powerful than any nerdy article I have ever written, no matter where it gets published. Because no one reads biological psychiatry on their Saturdays. They just don't. Okay, so when we were talking about Joey's behavior, to recognize that those are all symptoms of PTSD, restricted range of emotions, marked diminished interest, irritability or outbursts, exaggerated startle response, and difficulty concentrating. Think of all the things that this could be misinterpreted as. The most common is ADHD, right? So I spend a lot of time taking kids off ADHD medicine. Why? Because they don't have ADHD. They have trauma exposure and altered regulation of emotions. And if you don't treat ADHD, or if you don't treat PTSD specifically with evidence-based treatment, it doesn't go away. PTSD in kids is not responsive to medications. We can control the nightmares, but PTSD is not responsive to medications in children of any age. There is evidence-based therapy for it. EMDR works in older adolescents. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy works. The problem with all of that is it requires that child to be safe, right? So PTSD is actually something that can only develop after the threat has gone away, right? If the threat is still there, it's not PTSD, it's I'm really scared and it's a real threat, and these are my fear behaviors. We can help regulate the fear behaviors, but we can't get rid of PTSD if the kid isn't safe, and we can't get rid of it with medications, and we can't just pretend it's not there because it keeps going. Okay, attention, impulsivity, and oppositional behavior are ADHD and should be treated with medication. So this is a myth, right? And I spend a lot of time, because parents are like, yeah, that ADHD medicine doesn't do anything. It's great, because it doesn't if you don't have ADHD. That's not quite true. You might actually pay attention better. But, okay, attention problems are not ADHD. When I think about kids that are refugees, I think about the 55 other things that cause attention problems. Sleep, right? Have any of you had a sleepless night? And is it harder to pay attention the next day? Yeah, okay, great. Family stress, parents fighting. Anxiety will make you not pay attention to things that are not what you need to focus on to stay alive. Learning disabilities and hearing disabilities. Post-traumatic stress, interpersonal violence in your home, and hunger. All will cause attention problems. And oddly, none of those are responsive to stimulant medication. Okay. Another impact of trauma exposure, particularly violence, is that it changes your perception of threat. All right? So this is actually an attention bias task where we have a blank screen, we have a little marker, we show a facial expression, be it fear, neutral, or happy, and then we ask you to say where a target is. All right? And we either put it on the same side as the picture or we put it on the opposite side of the picture. And what we find is that kids that are exposed particularly to violence have an attention bias toward threat, right? And it can be one of two things, and it actually really matters for treatment purposes which way it goes. But either when they see threat, they orient to it much faster, or they have difficulty disengaging. So what does this look like? For the NOPD, I teach them this. So I have a traumatized adolescent male in New Orleans, and the NOPD comes up to him and goes, "What are you doing?" And what does my adolescent male do in New Orleans? He freezes, and he stares down the police officer. And my police officer says, "This kid is oppositional, he's being disrespectful, let's handcuff him." And what I have to teach him is, no, you just scared him. He won't ever tell you he's scared, but he cannot disengage from the source of his threat. He can't look down. And I will tell you, if you're an African-American male in New Orleans, your parents have spent years telling you, when you see NOPD, you look down, you say, "Yes, sir," because you're much more likely to get shot if you don't. But if your neural circuitry is biased to immediately respond to a threat, and you can't disengage, you can't change that pattern. And for kids that have been exposed to lots of violence, they can no longer tell you it's scary, right? So there's this idea of you've been swimming with sharks for so long, you don't think they're scary, right? So this is a friend of mine. He does this a lot, right? One day, the tiger shark decides to eat National Geographic's camera. But if I am so used to swimming with sharks, I know they're there, I will go into an emergency room and I will talk to a kid in New Orleans, and the resident will have come in and said, has anything scary ever happened to you? And the kid will say no. And I get to come in as like the smart attending. And I say, hey, when was the last time you saw somebody shot? And the kid goes, yesterday, my uncle, on the front porch. But they don't call it scary because it's part of their everyday life, right? So this attention bias, both in terms of our neurologic attention, how quickly we orient, how hard it is to disengage, but also what we're reporting. The problem is, just because they say they aren't scared of something, doesn't mean that their body isn't processing those physiologic systems aren't activated, right? And this is what I worry about most, which is the disconnect between what I am reporting and what I'm actually physiologically doing. And why do I worry about that? Because I'm a psychiatrist, right? And at the end of the day, when I treat people, how do I tell if they're better? Okay, that's not a rhetorical question. How do we tell that they're better? Okay, fine. We ask, right? Are you better? Psychiatrists don't measure blood pressure like people who are treating hypertension. We do not implement into our treatment paradigms biologic indicators of being better. And if I think that there might be this disconnect between self-report of less symptoms and physiologic distress, then I've put a Band-Aid over something and it's like a big festering wound and I missed it. And that's what keeps me up. Okay, sorry.
So at the beginning of your PowerPoint, you mentioned perception as well. So if kids aren't obviously biologically responding, or if kids are biologically responding to stress, but they're not saying they're scared, where does perception come into that, either in the effects or?
Right, well, so that's a great question, right? So perception can be my self-report perception, but perception can also be my physiologic process, right? But there are, I mean, again, he jumped out of an airplane. And so his perception was it was safe, right? And so while he'll generate a cortisol response, it won't be as gigantic as my cortisol response, right? And so that's a really, really important point, because if we can adjust appropriately, like not lie, be like, no, really, you're okay, you're safe, right? Or we can create a safety plan, then we can make something be a little less scary, right? So we do this for hurricanes, right? I live in New Orleans, although natural disasters seem to happen everywhere now, so it's no longer cornering my market. But what we do to help kids with hurricanes is we give them a safety plan, right? We say, this is what we're gonna do. For refugees, if mom gets taken away, what is your safety plan, right? Are you gonna be able to stay with your aunt? Who's going to be helping mom get back in? So this idea that we can still have scary events and we may not be able to take that fear away, but we can reshape or outline safety plans can actually shift that perception a little bit, okay? This is actually a study done looking at kids that were exposed to physical maltreatment. And what I want to show you is that we could put pictures up and slowly give you more and more granularity about a facial expression. And for kids that were abused, it took way more information for them to see a happy face. And when you put an angry face up there, they identified it much faster. So we lose the ability to perceive positive facial emotional expressions, and we increase our ability to interpret or identify negative emotional expressions. What does that mean? It means that if I am teaching a kid with trauma exposure, and I look at them and I'm like, oh, I can't believe you're gonna do your homework again. There is an automatic overinterpretation that is anger. And instead of it being interpreted as frustration, it can be interpreted as this person hates me. The inverse is also true, which means that if I am super excited about something that a child has done and I say, oh, that's a great job, right? And I use my neutral face, which my kids tell me is scary, they don't pick it up, right? But I have to be like, I'm so proud of you, you did it, right? Because they can't see happy the same way that a typically developing kid. So when we talk about trauma-informed practices, we really mean it because we want to lower the intensity of any sort of off or negative interactions, but we have to increase how we express positive things so that the kids can pick it up. Okay, all oppositional and aggressive behaviors are because kids are stubborn. We already talked about this a little bit. It's not true. Kids become aggressive because they're scared, or because they don't understand, or because they think that something is going on that they can't prevent. And we don't know what's going on in their head all the time. Or they're seeing pictures of, like, you know, somebody being killed, which happens a lot where I work. But that's driving aggressive and oppositional behavior, and it's not just because they're oppositional and stubborn. Okay, adverse childhood experiences. Ridiculously bizarre study that worked. Kaiser Permanente did this study. They had 14,000 people count up the number of bad things that happened before they were 18, and it predicts every health outcome imaginable. Diabetes, obesity, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, preterm birth, low birth weight, suggesting that these early experiences and my perception of them and recollection of them influence health outcomes across the lifespan.
Experience.
Yeah,
So like obesity is a bad experience for a child.
so
just
adverse
yeah.
childhood experiences. So these I skipped a whole section then, huh? Self-reported experiences before the age of 18 of medical trauma, parent being incarcerated, parents getting divorced, living with a member of family with substance use. So there's 10 of them. And you count them up on your fingers. And for people who had 4 or more of these in retrospective report, it turned out that their risk of diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and hypertension was elevated.
Okay.
So presumably you guys have not all heard about the adverse childhood experiences study, and now you have. Good job. But yes, so that's an important piece of it. So this idea that these things that happen before the age of 18 predict all of our primary drivers of health outcomes is really, really important. Because, does anyone know what this is? It's a gremlin, right? All of those health outcomes are age-related health conditions. So what we think is happening is that we are accelerating the aging process. So this is Yoda, right? So he lived a really good life and had great abilities to regulate his stress response system. He lived to be 900 years. Turns out that if you are a gremlin and you're fed after midnight, you turn into this guy. Accelerated aging. And proof that Steven Spielberg is a genius because he puts reminders of all of his characters in his movies. Okay, the idea is that adverse childhood experiences, these exposures to trauma, accelerate the aging process. They don't just influence mental health, they actually influence other health outcomes. I'm going to skip this just because we're running out of time. Sorry. Yeah?
Can you just mention for them the prenatal risk too, the data now showing?
I can, but it's not in this talk.
Just so they know.
Yeah, so we actually have data now that suggests that mom's adverse childhood experiences before she conceives the baby, as well as her stressors during pregnancy, differentially influence the trajectory of the child's physiologic development. So mom's adverse childhood experiences do one thing to, in particular, the autonomic nervous system and to this marker of cellular aging, and prenatal stress does another, suggesting that we are carrying these marks across generations, and that we can detect them in little kids too. I put this up here because we actually did a study looking at all of these markers in rhesus macaques, which are our closest biologic relatives. And what we found was the exact same thing. And why is that important? Because in rhesus macaques, there is no poverty. There is no poor educational system. There is no limited access to healthcare. The effects of having a disrupted early child environment, and in this case it was actually a maltreatment model, so being maltreated by your parent, in the equivalent of the first 2 years of life, in rhesus macaques influenced cortisol, this cellular marker of aging, and their brain development, meaning that this early exposure to this caregiving environment, regardless of all of the confounders that we see in human studies, right, had a lasting impact on their neurodevelopment and their physiologic development and their immune systems, which is really, really striking because I can't account for all of those variables in human studies. So when we think about mechanisms of how these things influence child development, and this is the prenatal as well as the postnatal world. So we've got this child, right? So we have a lot of things that can happen prenatal. Remember I talked to you about the brain part? There's a lot of brain development happening. So paying attention to moms who are pregnant. We will have potentially epigenetic imprints, so changes above the genome that may be transmitted across generations. But we have a whole postnatal world that we have an influence on, right? Because as I told you, brain development is not static. It changes. So I really don't like depressing information. And maybe we were talking about this last night. You're like, I don't like to stay there, right? So I was like, all right, what can we think of that we can implement to decrease the impact of these negative events, right? So it turns out that I think caregivers are bubble wrap, right? Everybody loves bubble wrap, but what can bubble wrap do? Well, ideally, it prevents your really lovely things from getting smashed by the post office. But they're protective, right? So we can't stop the post office from dropping boxes, but we can make the impact less. And so one really wonderful researcher who's in Philadelphia, Mary Dozier, has a 10-session in-the-home intervention where all they do is they coach mom to be responsive to their child. So attachment and biobehavioral catch-up does not actually address mom's substance use, depression, poverty, any of those things. It's just interactions with her child. Why is this really important? Because Mary Dozier has shown data out 5 years later that this 10-session, hour-long, hour-and-a-half intervention in the home for kids that have attachment and biobehavioral catch-up, their autonomic nervous system is actually better regulated. And this is 5 years post-intervention. So that we are correcting dysregulation in the autonomic nervous system just by working on early interactions with mom and child. So this was actually, the kids were about 2 to 5 years of age, and so the follow-up was at 9. So these are toddlers. This is a high-risk population with a referral but not removal into foster care because of neglect or abuse. Okay, so a high-risk population. But the impact of this intervention was on the autonomic nervous system. It actually, if the kids went into foster care and they did this same intervention, the sensitivity of the foster parent after this intervention actually mediated the relationship between child's language improvement. Okay, same age range that we're talking about. And improved executive function. And these effects are persistent and lasting, meaning that for kids that are exposed to traumatic early environments, in some cases even removed and placed in foster care, in other cases left in these kind of impoverished environments, we are able to correct physiologic stress response systems, we are able to influence language, and we are able to influence executive function. Okay? So the early caregiving, and we actually have data now saying that this early caregiving environment, in this case measured by attachment, which is this wonderful, you are my safe place and I can go find you anywhere and make me happy. So securely attached kids are these guys. And we sort of decrease the impact of cellular stress in those kids. And if we have avoidant or resistant, which we call kind of insecure attachment patterns or interactions with our caregiver, or disorganized, which is our sort of highest risk group, they have accelerated cellular aging. So this idea that the physiologic stress response systems, the cellular stress response systems, executive function and language, we now have data to suggest that if we get in those first couple years of life and we provide sensitive, contingent, and responsive caregiving, we can buffer the impact of adversity at those levels. This is just sort of saying that we have different vulnerabilities, right? So that how we influence these processes change over the course of development. And when I think about models, there are two places that I really want to intervene. The first is influencing mom's safety during pregnancy, because that's going to help her, it's going to improve birth outcomes, and it has an influence on child health and development. But then we have this window here. We're working on child self-regulation, and I think of that as social-emotional regulation, but also physiologic regulation. Through, and here we call it attunement, but this is really this back and forth, sensitive and responsive caregiving. We can regulate these processes and influence these kind of outcomes, so that this early caregiving environment has the ability to reshape these biologic processes that influence brain development and cognitive function. But how much depends on how early we can get in, and how much depends on how safe we can make that caregiving environment. So adversity and trauma affect the cells and connections. There is a component of adversity that may span generations, and it affects the development, but it also affects how quickly the development happens. And caregiving may be the ultimate bubble wrap. And I really like the Lorax. So, questions? Mm-hmm.
Here, let's move into Q&A period.
Okay.
And then we can I talk you into sitting up there with me? Would that be
Yes.
okay? Okay. And I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask a few questions here.
Great.
That was the fastest 40 minutes ever. It's like, it almost feels like
An
you're just...
entire semester of neuroscience, so good job.
Yeah. It feels like you're almost just touching the surface. I'm going to just throw out a couple questions, and then you guys will have at it. But one thing that I always find fascinating about this topic is why the science matters when intuitively we already know as a culture that you don't do bad things to kids, or when you do bad things to kids, when they, we see images on the news constantly of horrendous things happening to refugees and kids at the border. No one really has to be told, well, you might be surprised to find out this is bad for kids. But what the work that you're doing is telling us exactly what's going on in the brain so that we can understand how does trauma translate to poor development and to problems later on. Why as a culture and maybe even politically is it important that we understand what is going on in the brain when we already know it's bad to do bad things to kids?
So I think I will answer that three ways. One is that the vast majority of how we look at how a kid is doing is not biologic, right? It's report, like how well they're doing in school, right? Or, how well they're behaving. And the problem with that model is that if there are biologic changes that are happening that are accelerating the aging process or causing damage to organs, we miss that. And that we may have a whole group of kids that look okay now, but who end up having hypertension at a much earlier age, or who end up doing poorly later academically because their attentional processes weren't okay. And so I think without the science, we miss where we might need to do additional interventions.
But do you think that the neuroscience can amp up political will to actually intervene where needs to be, where we need to do that? I guess that's kind of what I'm wondering is, for those of us who already care, this makes a lot of sense. For those who don't yet, who have the power to solve some of these problems, does the neuroscience help? Or have you found that?
I do think it helps, because one of the challenges is, and as a mental health provider I can say this, is there's a lot of stigma, right? So that kid's just acting bad, right? And so if I'm a policymaker, and I'm dealing with this currently, my current district attorney in one of our counties in Louisiana thinks that the best way to deal with juvenile aggressive youth is to incarcerate them. And so if I say, no, they're not oppositional kids and they're stubborn, and I can show you that they're interpreting and that their brains are processing fear differently, I might have a better ability to impact that, to take it out of this stigmatization of like, you were just poorly parented or whatever. So I think there's a part of that. I think that it helps to link the brain to economic arguments. So this is something I try to do, which is you don't have enough money to pay for behavioral interventions for every kid, and yet we have this federal regulation, right? So if I can treat 20% of those kids that have ADHD that don't have ADHD and get them better, then your ability to allocate resources for your educational system are better. But I need the neuroscience to say, I can look at this kid, I can tell you that their brains are processing fear better. And if you create a trauma-informed school environment, your behavioral problems are gonna go down. And so using brain science can help with that and building the economic argument. I think that we make a lot of assumptions. And we now know that some stress is good. So it actually increases learning. Do I know what that point is? No, right? So we're not gonna put everybody in a bubble and not expose anybody. I think we also need to understand better differences and sort of this individual differences, but also what is happening in the brain because I can't tell you what makes a resilient child right now. And my bet is that there is something about their brains that are making them resilient. And so if I could get in and I could understand the differences in a resilient child's brain from a child that just crumbled with a little bit of stress.
Maybe you could develop resilience or...
Right, I could design an intervention that strengthened those neural circuits that could get at that.
Right. Okay, I have one question before I throw it out to the group, but last year when we did this, we had Nadine Burke-Harris come. This is related to the ACE study. So she is a doctor who is, I think she's now California's Surgeon General or something like that. But she's a real advocate for trauma screening, where every child who goes and gets a physical should be screened for whether they had these ACE events, these adverse childhood experiences, which when I hear her talk, that makes perfect sense. Of course you should add this to the list of things in 15 minutes that doctors are looking at, because then we can treat it and then these kids don't have as many problems. This is actually a very controversial issue right now in pediatrics. So I wanted to know, what do you think about, is that one intervention that should be undertaken society-wide where you screen every kid for trauma, and if not, why not?
So so I have had many conversations about the controversy. So one part of the controversy is we can't cure ACEs. It turns out I can't take away your trauma. You have it. And it can be very depressing, right? So, okay, great, you've had these 12 ACEs, you're gonna have hypertension. Oops. Okay, so that's not helpful, right? So I think
Very fatalistic.
Yeah, well, we do advocate it for adults, all right? And one reason is that the ACE study talks about population risk. It doesn't talk about individual risk, right? Now, granted, the link to health outcomes is not all through health behaviors, but what we don't know is if we say your chances of having diabetes or hypertension are higher because of your ACEs, right? Just like we do if you have a family history of diabetes or hypertension, then we give you the opportunity to potentially alter your behavior in a way that decreases those risks. And so what we don't know is if you do have this elevated risk because of your ACE score, can we decrease that risk by changing health behaviors, right? So I think there's that idea that we are giving you information that's kind of like familial risk, right? So we do this with adolescents. If you have a family history of substance abuse, I will say, I don't know if you're gonna get become an alcoholic, but you have 7 first-degree relatives that did, and your chances are way higher. So please delay drinking as long as possible, right? So I don't tell kids not to drink. I say the longer you wait, the more likely it is you're going to be able to drink when you're 30 and not be an alcoholic, right? So for kids, the idea is that if we talk about their ACE score early, potentially we can decrease the risk of these health behaviors or have them start to think about it earlier. I'm not sure that I would advocate for it in kids, because the problem is that the ACEs are not things that kids control. So it turns out no 6-year-old has the ability to keep their parents from getting divorced, and they can't keep their parents from being incarcerated or having substance use problems, and I really don't want to have them think that they can, because then they spend a lot of time working through that.
But if the doctor screens for it, is there a concern that the doctor will feel like I have to do something to adverse experiences?
Again, I don't think that there's any way to stop an adverse experience. So I'm not sure that I would necessarily advocate for it in the pediatric population, in part because, 1, we still have this whole window, but 2, that it's not something that is preventable, right? Where I do think that it is relevant is to talk about it sort of overall. And there are also these new scales called resilience scales. And those are actually a really interesting idea, because one of the biggest sort of resilience builders relates to your social network. So do you have a social network that is supportive, right? And so for kids and for families that have high ACE exposure, the idea would be that potentially you want to strengthen their social network. So that means spending more time at your church, or making sure that you really integrate with positive family experiences, or become more active in your child's school. So that the idea is to balance out this risk with saying maybe your kid's going to be healthier or do better if we build you a better social network. And so if I were to do screening in kids, I would do kind of that dual screening. I actually do the dual screening in adults. But the idea that you want to identify where you could build resilience would be what I would advocate more than screening for ACEs in kids.
Right. Okay. Okay. Ariel, just choose a random person. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation, Stacy. It was nice, and I enjoyed the little humor inputs. I'm from South Africa, and it's very interesting. We have a lot of complex stress. And I like this word that you used, dimensional. So it kind of there's a lot of it all at once. And you said that the treatments that are proven or that they're evidence driven could be CBT or EMDR, and other trauma-informed therapies, but that only works if the child is actually safe and if they, if the social circumstances then support this treatment, or at least the treatment. But I kind of just wanted to ask then, what can be done if if the complexity of the stress continues and it's chronic? I know that we've got some evidence-driven programs in South Africa that kind of focus on the caregiver and home visiting programs. But, I just suppose it's just this question in my mind about what can work in a complex situation all the time, including, refugee camps. And yeah. Okay, thank you.
Well, so the first thing that I want to clarify is that when I say we don't know, it's because the fundamental core of cognitive behavioral therapy is that your fear is not real, right? It's an over-exaggeration or an over-interpretation, right? That fear is no longer present, right? And to be very clear, cognitive behavioral therapy has evidence base for depression, for anxiety, and PTSD, right? But those are specific diagnoses with specific symptoms, and what we know about cognitive behavioral therapy is it decreases the symptoms, right? So whether or not it is addressing, I mean, there's a little bit of data that suggests that it influences some of the autonomic nervous system and the cortisol reactivity, but not super clean. And so it is important to treat specific diagnoses with what we have, right? Because having PTSD and depression makes it harder to do every other intervention, right? So it's important to treat those things. What I don't have is data that says that these treatments in complex trauma, high threat, high deprivation, impact the biology, right? And so that is why I am very careful about it. Do I think that it's a good idea to give kids cognitive behavioral therapy? Absolutely. Because I think there's a regulation component to it, like learning to identify your own physiologic responses to fear is important, and learning relaxation is important. But for me to say that it is something that we should implement, I'm not comfortable saying that because I need data. And intervening with interventions is often done without the data. And that is one of the things that I really struggle with, is that we see these things and they're really upsetting and we want to do something. But what I want to caution everyone about is that as we invest money in this, please make sure that we are investing in the evaluation that makes sure that we are actually having an impact.
Have you seen interventions that people have used widely that turned out to be not evidence-based and caused harm?
Yes. And I mean, again, not maliciously.
One example? Yeah.
Yeah, I blocked it out. They did a bunch of this for Katrina.
Like the debriefing? I know
Yeah,
that.
So they did a bunch of that, sort of psychological first aid. So in New Orleans, post-Katrina, they had a bunch of people from the outside world come in and do all this psychological first aid, and then they all left. And it didn't.
And when you say, you mean where they sat them out around a table and said, tell us what happened to you?
Yep. And it turns out it wasn't applicable because everybody had lost their home and people were still dying. And oh yeah, and our rates of PTSD are now like 40% in some of our school systems. And so there was this influx of things that hadn't ever been evaluated for this type of complex trauma that wiped out all of your social support, your neighborhood, shattered, fractured families and school systems and healthcare systems. And psychological first aid was never designed to fix that, right? And when we add an entire other level of complexity, which is the cultural components of these groups, right? So part of social support and network is your culture. And our refugees don't have that, right? Or we don't have enough of it, or they are fractured from their families. And so we have added a level of complexity that our studies were not designed to, did not capture or pay attention to. And so what may be effective in some societies may go against cultural norms, or may, you know, I don't have enough information about the cultural structure or expectations of each and every refugee society to say that what we know about creating a safe environment, or how I work with a kid to create their safety plan, if it doesn't fit with their cultural norms, then it may not be a good idea. And that's, I think, where I really, really worry, right? So if we're gonna do these interventions, to spend some time making sure that we are culturally adapting them and appropriately culturally adapting them, and then actually doing a randomized controlled trial with a control group so that we can see whether we are making things worse. So there's always this huge investment and a desire to fix things, and again, I don't think it's malicious, but I am not confident in the science to say that what we know is sufficient to mass roll out interventions, and certainly not mass roll out for all of these different groups of people that are being traumatized in different ways. It's, and it's not a one-size-fits-all.
Can I add one
No.
important point? I think, based on my work with families, sometimes it's the intervention is not necessarily directly on the child itself, himself, herself. Anyway, the intervention is more on kind of changing the toxic environment, the chronicle or the stress, the toxic stress that they're living in. So instead of just working with the child while the toxic stress is all around them, maybe the first intervention would be on the atmosphere, the environment itself, as a first level, the macro, and maybe the family as a second level. Then we do the work on the child. Before, like, we think sometimes in terms of which method is better. Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Thank you, Stacy. I was wondering what kind of behavior can last for years after these stresses of kids fleeing their country from a bad situation. Then it's a 3-week trip, and then they have to go to a refugee camp, and they don't know if they're staying, and then they have to flee that refugee camp, and they have to go to another place, and then they have to go to a country where people don't like them, and it lasts for forever until they realize they're going to be migrants and refugees until.
So I think that's a difficult question to give you a simple answer to, so I apologize. So the first thing is that if they develop PTSD, the behaviors that we can identify are an exaggerated startle response, right? So that's one. Irritability and outbursts. So just random emotional changes, right? Those things, attentional problems, those behaviors, if a child develops post-traumatic stress disorder, are chronic. So once we get past 6 months, there is no evidence to suggest that those are going to get better without treatment. So if you ask me like those, I have a pretty good grasp of. Where we think of the potential to have sort of behavioral problems later that make a difference are things like stabilizing interpersonal relationships, right? So this is an area where I would be worried with highly traumatized kids, that really being able to trust people in your environment, which is a fundamental component of being able to develop relationships, and not just romantic relationships, but just interpersonal relationships. I think that is an area where we see persistent effects, and probably even outside of psychopathology. And an area, if we could design really good interventions to address, would be great, because I think that's a resilience core, right? So social engagement, having people that you can talk to and process information with, building your social networks is a protective factor for many things. And I think that's one of the areas where I worry about this complex trauma, is that if I never feel safe or I never trust anybody, I'm not going to build those interpersonal relationships. And that's another sort of example of something that I feel comfortable saying is persistent, with the idea that there are a whole subset of kids that can go through that and do exceptionally well, right? And I also think that's part of this message, which is when we talk about where we are intervening with the ones that are not doing well, right? And I think that part of the story is to say that there's probably 20 to 30% of kids that do really, really well. And what we haven't studied enough or understand, particularly in the neuroscience, is what is going on that makes those kids okay, right? I would love to believe it's that they all have this secret caregiver that I don't know about, and it's really just they've got much better bubble wrap, but I don't think that's it. I think there are other pieces. And so that's also an important part of this message.
Hi. My question is kind of about how the science community is perceiving all this data that you showed us. We are not experts in this issue. So we've seen a lot of studies that prove some things that Karen said, that are basic instincts, that you need to nurture a child, you need to take care of the child, they're developing. But how does the science community is looking at or working with or trying to prevent these there's these graphs and these lines that show, for example, all the things that a pregnant woman can do to help the child develop, or things that could happen that would endanger the child development and while they're still in the womb. How do we prevent, in considering that we're in this rise of authoritarianism, politicians or groups or different lobbyists from taking these simplified images and using them as scientific proof to try and control maybe women's bodies when they're pregnant, and vulnerable women, refugee women, for example, and also use it, for very bad purposes, or trying to control how we raise our kids or how pregnant women should act or not act. Like, considering that we have climate change denials, that we have people who believe the earth is flat, how can we empower these women instead of controlling them,
So yeah, that's actually, Bruce isn't here, but we were talking about this at dinner last night. So one of the areas where I do a lot of research is on prenatal stress. And I was at a scientific meeting a couple weeks ago, and there was an entire session devoted on how we talk to the press. And they were like, we don't want to tell them anything because we're already scared that we're going to scare moms more, right? But then if we let the press get it, then, and this came from the scientists, they're like, we're going to put everybody in bubbles and it's going to be like The Handmaid's Tale. And so there was this terrified component of all of the researchers. So what, I told Bruce, I was like, fine, I'm just bringing all of you guys to the next scientific meeting so we can have this back and forth. So I think a couple of things in terms of particularly focusing on prenatal stress. So one is that prenatal stress is poorly defined. Okay, it is, again, not cortisol. And for all of the stupid studies that are out there, some done by my friends that I love very much, there is no relationship between the impact on a baby and mom's cortisol levels. There's not. Okay, we know incredibly little about exactly what is prenatal stress and how it impacts the baby, right? What we do know is that there are certain things that are bad for babies to be exposed to, right? And it turns out one of those is actually marijuana. So I have about 25% of moms smoking pot in New Orleans because someone told them it was good for nausea, right? So we do have things that are, don't ask, it is good for nausea, but not when you're pregnant. But what we do have are specific things we know are bad for pregnant women. It turns out they're actually bad for everybody. It's just that when you get old, you get to do bad things to your own body, right? And we have this baby, so we're not supposed to do things that are bad for our kids too, right? So that's one piece. I think the second, or the sort of third part about the prenatal stress in particular is that what is best for a pregnant woman is what makes her feel less stressed, right? And here, all of our data is really about the perception because it's not tracking onto our physiologic processes. And so if locking her up doesn't make her feel safe, then it's not good for the baby. And there is no data out there that suggests that we get better outcomes if we incarcerate mothers. Zero. And that would be the argument that I would say. That part of what is really important in this prenatal period is that mom feels safe and that she has appropriate access to care and to nutrition. And that is sort of the argument that I put forward, because it is really important to say that just preventing her doing crack is not enough, right? It turns out crack isn't as bad as anybody thought it is. And it actually turns out that babies withdraw less from moms who are intermittently using heroin than if they're on Suboxone. But that doesn't mean I want you doing heroin when you're pregnant, right? But it's this idea that that is not a sufficient. So preventing mom from ingesting a toxin is not sufficient to keep that baby safe. And that is probably the argument I would put forward in that case. Is that helpful at all?
And by the way, I just wanted to encourage you guys to drill down on what you were saying before about scientists' view on the press. And and
Oh, no,
how.
we're just having a meeting. You guys are all coming.
Well, it's just interesting that that scientists have such little faith in journalists being able to be nuanced and understand the science and not make things worse, whereas someone like you obviously, feels differently. So we're going to have small groups later, and we
Well,
can.
and more
kind of-
importantly,
yeah.
that they're like, I'm not answering the phone. And I was like, how is that helpful?
Well, and why do this research if not to get it out into the world? Maybe that's a whole other question.
Yeah, that's a
but-
whole other,
Yeah, that's the
like-
science. Okay.
Yeah, and that
Sure.
really depends on who the scientist is.
Fair enough, yeah.
So you talked about how children who have experienced trauma, they interpret facial expressions differently. And I immediately thought about us as reporters going into, for example, refugee camps and meeting kids for the first time. And not only that, but we're asking them questions. How should we as reporters and journalists think about our own body language and facial expression when we are approaching children who've been through trauma?
Yes, I mean, there's a whole literature on what it means to be trauma informed. I think that what I would say in concrete terms is lower your tone, slow down, and recognize that you may have to repeat things because they may or may not be processing. I would be empathetic, but I would also be very, we talk a lot about this, so slowing down, getting to their level, trying to make yourself as unthreatening as possible. I think looking to see if they are utilizing a caregiver as a safe person, right? So for little kids in particular, they may reference a caregiver. And so sometimes maybe going in and having the caregiver and you talk together with the child near, particularly for little kids, can help. And I think being very able to say, to give the child the agency to say that they don't want to talk about something is really, really important. So when we talk about anxiety disorder, sometimes we talk about this thing called locus of control, right? And so the idea that they have some agency over what they are doing, and if you don't have the ability to give them total agency, have them have partial agency. So where would you like to talk about this? Where do you want me to sit? Where do you want to sit? Right? So do you want to color while we're doing this, right? So it turns out that kids do a lot when you are distracting them or when they're doing something else. They can tell you things, right, when it's not their pure focus. So I think those are sort of concrete of things of that I would do. And be very cognizant of even neutral expressions can be interpreted as negative. So my kids made me look in front of the mirror, and I'm pretty scary a lot of the times when I think I'm being neutral. I like that with med students, but probably not with my patients. But so I think that's a really important thing is sort of, if you have the opportunity to talk to members of that society or culture before you go in, to sort of ask and say, what are sort of things that would make me kind of more threatening, or are there specific things that are culturally inappropriate? So being very cognizant of the norms of their society is also another kind of piece of that.
Hi, Stacy. I just want to bring the subject a little bit to Brazil because we're facing a violence there is the same as New Orleans, maybe in the outskirts of the cities. And I think that now we are here discussing that, and there are people facing this violence. And my question is, how can families can be this safe environment to the kids if they are facing the violence too? And the families don't have the place to search for help, even social policies to search for help in the peripheries of Brazil.
Yeah, so that is a really tough thing, right? And I think I don't have a good answer. What I tell our families is, to really outline what you're doing to be safe, right? I spend a lot of time talking to moms in particular because they sometimes use yelling and screaming and scaring kids to get them to behave. And that's not really what is helpful. But I also have to address mom's fear and where it's coming from. And so many cases we'll talk a lot about owning that you're scared, and that not wanting the kid to leave the house after a certain time is because it's not safe. And that we may not be able to be safe here, but I need you to be safe. And so a lot of it is having parents or grown-ups own their own emotions. So if you're scared, your kid knows you're scared, or they know that something's not right. And they may not always interpret that as you scared. It may be that they interpret it as you're angry. And they may interpret it as it's my fault, right? And so to help parents be able to say that sometimes I yell because I'm so scared. And because the world outside is not safe, and sometimes the world inside is not safe. And those kind of conversations can be helpful. I throw neuroscience in there all the time because it turns out that what parents want for kids is generally for them to succeed and do well. And so we talk about how if you're always yelling at your kid, it's harder for them to learn and pay attention. And then we also spend a lot of time saying that after something happens is not the time to process it, right? We just want to go somewhere and calm down. And later, when you're calm, to say, we had this big explosion and I was screaming. And at that time, I was really worried that you weren't safe. And that's why I was screaming. But you can't do that until the physiologic systems have slowed down. So there is a component of being able to say, I'm not going to process this or talk about this or tell you why right after. Give it some time to back it up. I do run into a lot of parents who don't want to acknowledge their own fears to their kids, and they, I don't know, have you guys ever heard this? Oh, my kid doesn't know how I feel. Like, I hear it all the time. I'm like, oh, really? Okay, sure, right? So this idea that if the child is connected to a caregiver, that they're gonna recognize something is wrong, and they'll interpret it in many, many, many different ways. My favorite example for kids that I use for scary environments is the difference between a boogeyman and the vampire. So no one's scared of vampires, right? Because you know, like, the list of 25 things to keep vampires away, right? Crosses, garlic, stay in daylight, right? Have a bunch of wooden stakes around. But the boogeyman is terrifying because we don't know where he is. And we don't know how to stop him. Now, there's also like all these other scary creatures. That's one I run with. But this idea that as we learn how to keep ourselves safe from vampires, right, we're less bothered by them, right? That's why they made all those teenage movies about them. They didn't make teenage movies about romanticizing boogeymen, right? They made it about vampires because they're less scary. But if it's an unknown and it's unpredictable and it's and there's no safety plan, then it's much more terrifying.
Hi, Stacy. This has been so great. So I'm going to ask something that is a bit off topic, but it's on the other side of the pendulum, so extreme side, which is, I read a Guardian article recently that talks about toxic anxiety, so for overprotection. So how do you see that? And, you know, not today, we read a lot about that. And so what is that in reality, especially if you consider the different layers of stress, and what is that positive stress, and how do we take that without overprotecting kids?
Yeah, so it's kind of like the helicopter parent. So I struggle with the term toxic stress a lot. I think it's a great sort of marketing, right? And we need to market. But similar to a lot of things, it's not really accurate, right? Because toxic stress is often equivalent, like you have toxic amounts of cortisol. Well, that's just not accurate. So we need to be thoughtful about that. I think in terms of this overprotection, right, that is equally problematic. And it's problematic from a neuroscience standpoint because it interferes with my experience that I need to develop my skills, right? And so if I don't get to go into an environment and have a success, then I don't learn the skills to manage that environment, right? So it's about this giving your children exposures that are manageable, sometimes allowing them to fail. We don't do that nearly enough with our kids right now. Everybody gets trophies, and this is in like happy populations. Keeping requirements, right? So chores, routines, expectations. Those are what I talk to with parents about, and they're like, well, how could they possibly do that? You know, we have, everything is a disaster. And I tell them that in order for their child to grow and be healthy, they have to understand expectations, and they have to have guidelines, right? So, but they also have to have freedom to learn and to grow and to try new things. And so this is where I think the neuroscience is incredibly helpful, because if you don't let your child have developmentally appropriate experiences, then they don't learn and they don't grow their brains right. This overprotection kind of piece, I think, really depends on the environment that they're in, right? So how valid is the need to do this? Where I have more experience with this is with kids that are immunocompromised. So kids that are getting cancer treatment or have had liver transplants or things like that, where their immune system is squished. Parents don't let them go anywhere, and they're terrified. And if they get one cold, they're gonna die, right? And so we spend a lot of time talking about that doesn't mean that they can't go to school. It just means that they can't be snotted on by a kid that has the flu, right? And so working with parents to establish appropriate boundaries. And when you've got really scared parents, it might be just creating one little place where the kid has some freedom, right? So we're not gonna be able to shift everything, but talking about, okay, fine, let them choose between 2 bedtimes, right? So working at that level, if that makes sense. But I think that not allowing kids to have experiences is equally problematic for brain development in particular.
I think we have time for probably about one more question. And just FYI, Stacy will be sticking around this afternoon for us to kind of drill down, so we'll get more chances to ask.
Hi, I've got the mic. That's okay? Hi. So we've heard a lot about brain plasticity and sort of windows of intervention. And my worry is what happens to children further down the line, so teenagers? Does it get to a stage with young adults where it's too late to intervene? Have we lost them?
So that was actually one of the slides, which is sort of the input is going to be greater. I actually am hoping that some of my friends that study adolescence are doing the work that I need them to do. So there are other sensitive periods in development, right? So we think the prenatal period is absolutely, we think the first 1,000 days, absolutely. There's a lot of remodeling in the brain that happens in the peripubertal period. And there's actually a lot of plasticity that happens, a lot of pruning that happens then. So if you ask me, another really, really important time point to intervene is right when puberty is starting, right? So that pubertal time period when all of your neuroendocrine systems are changing is a huge open area of opportunity. And it probably extends into middle to late adolescence. But it turns out that the transition to parenthood is actually another really interesting area of plasticity. So in terms of epigenetics, estrogen is a demethylator, and it crosses the blood-brain barrier. So for anybody that's ever had a baby, your brain got completely rewired. And you knew that, right? There's some amazing work done up from Yale where you actually rewire dads' brains, which is good because some of them need more rewiring than others. But this transition to parenthood is another potential untapped place of plasticity because there's huge changes in the brain, there's huge neuroendocrine shifts. And so I don't believe that we're ever really lost, but I do believe that it's harder, and what we do is different, right? So For an adolescent, it is going to be potentially less about the caregiving relationship than it is about the peer relationship, right? For a transition to parenthood, it's going to be about building capacities to be an effective parent and your network to help you, right? Because it turns out no one can raise a child on their own. It's just, we can't, no one can. But so I think when we think about interventions and we think about sensitive periods or greatest areas of opportunity, we also want to think about what are the appropriate developmental achievements of that age range and make sure that those interventions match. Because you really don't need a sensitive and responsive like mother at 19, it turns out, which my 19-year-old will tell you. Like, Mom, stop being a contingent sensitive caregiver. I would like that from my girlfriend. Wait, no. But it's really true, I'm sorry.
Are those sensitive periods, is it the same sensitive period for when the most damage can occur during trauma
Yes.
as when the best interventions can
Yes.
occur? So plastic for good or plastic for bad?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Is it true for males and females both?
Yeah, so becoming a dad actually rewires their brains too. Yeah.
What about for young teenage mothers?
You're
Double whammy.
hugely important. And I think, for those of you who are looking at trafficked and sort of, sexual assaults and all of those things that are happening in those environments, that is an incredibly high-risk group for a whole variety of reasons, because you're having, if they do become pregnant, it's another sort of level of traumatization. You're running the risk of sexually transmitted infections, so you're dysregulating the immune system, but you're also highly plastic. They need a really good bubble that they choose that is not enforced upon them.
All right, I think we're out of time. Thank you so much, Stacy, and she'll be around the rest of the day, right, for more questions.
Yes.